Imagine waking up at midnight. Not because you had a nightmare, not because an alarm interrupted your sleep, but simply because you were supposed to be awake. For centuries, people may have lived with a strange nightly rhythm, a first sleep after sunset, a quiet period of wakefulness in the middle of the night, and then a second sleep before morning. They prayed, they talked, they tended the fire, they thought. So when did humans stop sleeping this way? And perhaps more strangely, why did we begin believing that 8 uninterrupted hours was the natural way to sleep?
Tonight, we are going back to a world before alarm clocks, electric lights, smartphones, and bright bedrooms. A world where darkness arrived with the sunset, nights stretched slowly across the seasons, and sleep was shaped less by clocks than by firelight, custom, and the natural rhythm of the night. As we travel from the ancient world through medieval Europe and into the age of industry, we will follow one simple mystery. Did humans really sleep differently before modern life changed the night? And somewhere between the first sleep and the second, we may discover that the history of sleep is also the history of how humans learned to control darkness itself.
Long before alarm clocks told people when to wake, before electric lights pushed back the darkness, and before bedrooms became quiet private spaces designed almost entirely for sleep, the night was a very different thing. For most of human history, darkness was not something people could simply switch off. It arrived slowly. The sun disappeared behind the hills, the last colours faded from the sky, smoke curled upward from cooking fires, animals became quieter, voices softened, and as the darkness spread across the landscape, the world itself seemed to shrink. There were no glowing streets outside the window, no blue light from a phone, no clock quietly reminding you that you had 7 hours and 12 minutes left before morning. There was simply night.
And for thousands of years, that night shaped the way human beings lived. Imagine a small settlement long before electricity. The day has been exhausting. There has been food to gather, water to carry, tools to repair, animals to tend, crops to work, children to care for. As the sun sinks lower, the final tasks of the day are completed. A fire burns in the center of the household. Its light is weak compared with the brightness we live with today, but in the darkness it feels powerful. Faces appear and disappear in the flickering orange glow. Shadows move across the walls. Someone tells a story. Someone finishes a piece of work. Someone checks the animals. Then, gradually, people begin to sleep. There is something important about this moment.
For ancient and medieval people, sleep was not necessarily separated from the rest of life by the rigid boundary we are familiar with today. Modern life tends to divide the day into clearly defined blocks: work, dinner, entertainment, sleep, and each block has its own expected time. But before mechanical clocks and artificial lighting became widespread, the boundaries were much softer. People could not simply decide to turn the night into another afternoon. If you wanted light after sunset, you needed fuel, a torch, an oil lamp, a candle, a hearth, and all of these were limited. That meant darkness had a practical power over human behavior. Night encouraged people to slow down, and eventually to sleep.
But there is another question. What happened after people fell asleep? Today, many of imagine imagine sleep as a single uninterrupted journey. You go to bed, you close your eyes, several hours pass, then morning arrives. But that assumption belongs partly to the world we have built around ourselves. The human body, of course, has its own biological rhythms, yet the way people organize sleep can also be influenced by culture, environment, work, light, temperature, and social expectations. And when those things change, sleeping habits can change with them. Consider how different the night would have felt to someone living centuries ago. There might be no street outside,
No neighboring apartment glowing through the darkness. No refrigerator humming quietly in the kitchen. No television. No computer. No notifications suddenly lighting up a room. The darkness would have been almost complete. And complete darkness does something strange to our sense of time. Without a clock, how would you know whether it was midnight? How would you know whether 3 hours had passed? You might listen to the wind, to animals, to footsteps, to the fire, to the occasional movement of another person inside the house. Time was experienced rather than displayed. And this matters when we begin looking at historical descriptions of sleep, because people in the past did not always describe their nights using the language we use today. They often measured life through events rather than exact minutes. The evening meal, the setting of the sun, the church bell,
The changing of a watch, the approach of dawn. Even the stars could serve as a rough guide. The night was not a blank space between 2 days. It was its own part of life, and sometimes it was surprisingly active. In a village, someone might need to check a fire, a guard might be awake, a mother might tend a child, a traveler might arrive late, animals might need attention, a religious community might rise during the night for prayer. And in winter, when darkness lasted much longer, the distinction between evening and night could feel especially different from our modern experience. This does not mean that every ancient person followed the same sleep pattern. They did not. Human societies were never perfectly uniform. Farmers, soldiers, monks, merchants, sailors, parents, children, wealthy households, and people living in poverty could all experience the night differently. Geography mattered too. So did season. So did climate. So did safety.
and so did the simple question of whether a person had enough food, warmth, and shelter to sleep comfortably. That is why the history of sleep is more complicated than the popular story of ancient people slept one way and modern people sleep another. There was no single ancient sleep schedule. But historians have noticed something intriguing in certain historical sources. References appear to a division of the night, a first sleep, and later another sleep. The idea is strange to us because our language usually treats sleep as one continuous event. But in some older writings, the night appears to have been divided into different stages. And if those references reflect everyday practice, they suggest that at least some people once experienced the night differently from the way many people do today.
The most fascinating part is what supposedly happened in between. Not necessarily a sudden frightening awakening, not necessarily insomnia, but a period of quiet wakefulness, a strange middle hour. The world outside was still dark, most people around you were asleep, and yet you were awake. Imagine opening your eyes in that world. There is no electric light waiting for you. You do not reach for a phone. There may not even be a clock nearby. You simply lie there in the darkness. The fire has almost gone out. The room is cold. Somewhere nearby, another person breathes slowly in sleep. Outside, the settlement is silent. For a modern person, waking at such an hour might immediately feel like a problem. We look at the clock. We calculate how many hours remain. We worry that tomorrow will be ruined.
But perhaps people in earlier societies did not always interpret nighttime wakefulness in exactly the same way. Perhaps waking during the night could simply be part of the night. And this is where the mystery begins, because scattered across historical texts are references that seem to describe people sleeping, waking, and sleeping again. But what exactly did those phrases mean? Were they describing a widespread human habit, a literary expression, a religious practice, or simply the experience of some people in particular circumstances?
The evidence does not give us a perfectly simple answer, and that uncertainty is important.
Because the real story is not that everyone in the ancient world went to bed at the same time, woke at midnight, stayed awake for an hour, and then returned to sleep. History rarely works that neatly. Instead, we have fragments, words, descriptions, customs, old routines, and clues buried inside writings created for completely different reasons. Piece by piece, those clues allow us to look into a world where the night was organized differently. A world without the pressure of the alarm clock, without the glow of the city, without the expectation that every minute of darkness should be productive, or that every interruption of sleep must be corrected.
And perhaps that is why the old references to a first sleep feel so unusual to us. They make us wonder whether something we consider completely natural was actually shaped by the world around us. The darkness, the fire, the length of the night, the absence of artificial light, and the rhythm of a society that moved at a very different pace. So, as the imaginary fire beside us burns lower, let us stay with that quiet household for a little longer. The first sleep has ended, the night is still young, and somewhere in the darkness a person slowly opens their eyes. They do not know what time it is.
They do not need to. For now, they simply lie awake, waiting for the second half of the night to begin. The person lying awake in that dark room does not know that centuries later, people would find the idea of this moment strangely familiar. They only know that sleep has left them for a while. Perhaps the fire has become a bed of glowing embers. Perhaps the wind has changed outside. Perhaps someone else in the household is awake too. There is no bright clock to announce midnight, no number on a screen, no expectation that sleep must continue without interruption. Just darkness and a quiet stretch of time. This is where the historical mystery becomes more interesting, because when we begin looking through older writings, we find repeated references to different periods of sleep. One of the most famous clues comes from the ancient world. In Greek and Roman literature, expressions appear that divide the night into separate watches or periods. Some texts describe people rising during the night, while others use language that seems to distinguish an earlier sleep from a later one. These references do not prove that every person followed a strict two-sleep schedule, but they show something important. The idea of sleeping, waking, and then sleeping again was not completely unfamiliar to people living before modern industrial society. And perhaps the most famous historical phrase associated with this pattern is the idea of a first sleep. That phrase appears in older English sources.
In medieval and early modern writings, people sometimes referred to the first sleep as though it were an ordinary and recognizable part of the night. There could also be references to a second sleep. At first, this sounds almost like a medical prescription. Sleep for a few hours, wake up, then sleep again. But that is not necessarily what the sources are telling us. The language itself is revealing. If writers could casually refer to a first sleep, then their readers were expected to understand what that meant. It suggests that, in at least some communities and periods, nighttime sleep could be imagined as something that happened in stages. And once you notice these references, they begin appearing in unexpected places.
Literature, religious writings, medical discussions, everyday descriptions, even ordinary expressions can preserve traces of older habits. The ancient world gives us some of the earliest clues, but as we move into medieval Europe, the evidence becomes especially fascinating. The night was often divided by religious and social rhythms. Church bells marked important moments. Monastic communities followed schedules that could bring people out of bed during the night. guards watched through the darkness. Travelers moved according to practical necessity, and households adjusted their routines according to season, work, and light. For monks, nighttime wakefulness could have a very specific meaning. The night was not merely a period of unconsciousness. It could be a time for prayer. A bell might call members of a religious community from their beds. Candles would be lit. Quiet footsteps would cross stone floors.
A chapel that had been dark only moments before would slowly come alive with human presence. Then, after the prayers or religious duties were finished, people could return to their beds. This is different from saying that medieval monks invented the two-sleep pattern. They did not. Nor does monastic life tell us how everyone slept. But it demonstrates something important about the pre-modern night. Waking during darkness was not automatically considered unnatural. There were social structures built around being awake at night. The same was true outside monasteries. Imagine a medieval household. The family has gone to sleep. The room is dark. Several hours pass.
Then someone wakes. Perhaps they tend the fire. Perhaps they check a child. Perhaps they speak quietly with another member of the household. Perhaps they pray. Perhaps they simply lie awake. Then, eventually, they return to sleep. The most intriguing historical references suggest that this kind of nighttime wakefulness could sometimes be considered ordinary. But why? Why would someone wake naturally in the middle of the night? One possible explanation is the environment itself. Before electric lighting, evening was much darker. People were exposed to far less artificial light after sunset than we are today. That does not mean darkness automatically created a universal two-shift sleep pattern. Human sleep is far too complicated for such a simple explanation. But light does influence the body's timing system, and the amount of light available after sunset was dramatically different in earlier centuries. A candle could illuminate a small area. An oil lamp could provide useful light. A hearth could brighten a room.
But none could reproduce the intense, constant illumination of a modern city. The result was a world where evening naturally encouraged people towards rest. And once asleep, the length and timing of that sleep could vary. There was another factor too. The night itself was longer than many modern people experience psychologically. Today, if you stay awake until midnight, you may feel that you have been awake for only a few hours after dinner. But in a pre-industrial household, the evening could begin when the sun disappeared. There was no television schedule, no streaming service, no endless scroll, no brightly lit shopping district waiting outside. Once the day's work was finished, there were fewer reasons to remain awake.
People might go to bed relatively early, and when bedtime begins earlier, waking in the middle of the night becomes much less surprising. This is one of the reasons historians are cautious. A person who sleeps early, wakes for a while, and then sleeps again does not necessarily have a special biological sleep pattern. The same person might simply be experiencing a long night divided by a period of wakefulness. And that distinction matters, because popular discussions sometimes turn the historical evidence into a simple claim. Everyone used to sleep in 2 shifts. The reality is more complicated. Human sleep has always varied.
Some people slept longer. Some slept less. Some woke during the night. Some probably slept through. Some had irregular schedules because of work. Others because of illness, hunger, caregiving, travel, or environmental conditions. History does not give us a single timetable. Instead, it gives us glimpses. And those glimpses become especially powerful when they appear in ordinary language. Think about how strange it would be if people today casually spoke of their first sleep and second sleep. You might tell a friend, "I woke after my first sleep, sat beside the fire for a while,
and then returned for my
second. They would probably ask what you meant, but in some historical contexts, such language seems to have been understandable. That is the clue, not proof of a universal biological rule, but evidence that the concept itself existed. And perhaps the most surprising part is that the period between sleeps was not necessarily wasted time. Modern culture often treats nighttime wakefulness as something to eliminate. If you wake at 2 in the morning, you may immediately think something has gone wrong. But in older societies, a dark middle period could have its own uses. It could be a quiet moment for reflection, for prayer, for conversation, for tending the household, for intimate encounters, for checking livestock, or simply for lying awake in the silence. In a world without artificial entertainment, even doing nothing had a different character. There was no screen demanding attention, no stream of messages.
no news updates arriving every few minutes. The darkness itself became the environment. And perhaps that changed how people experienced waking. Imagine sitting near a dying fire in the middle of the night. Outside, the village is almost completely silent. The stars are visible. The cold air moves through the cracks in the walls. You hear an animal somewhere in the distance. You hear the breathing of sleeping people nearby. There is nothing urgent to look at. Nothing to scroll through. Nothing telling you what you should be doing. The night simply exists. And after some time, tiredness returns. You lie down again. The second sleep begins. By the time dawn finally appears, the world outside is changing color. Birds begin to call. The sky becomes pale. The household slowly wakes. And the night disappears into morning. To the people living through it, this may not have seemed remarkable at all. It was simply night. No news updates arriving every few minutes. The darkness itself became the environment. And perhaps that changed how people experienced waking. Imagine sitting near a dying fire in the middle of the night. Outside, the village is almost completely silent. The stars are visible. The cold air moves through the cracks in the walls. You hear an animal somewhere in the distance. You hear the breathing of sleeping people nearby. There is nothing urgent to look at. Nothing to scroll through. Nothing telling you what you should be doing. The night simply exists. And after some time, tiredness returns. You lie down again. The second sleep begins. By the time dawn finally appears, the world outside is changing color. Birds begin to call. The sky becomes pale. The household slowly wakes. And the night disappears into morning. To the people living through it, this may not have seemed remarkable at all. It was simply night.
But centuries later, those small phrases about first sleep and second sleep would become clues to a forgotten possibility, that the way humans organize sleep may not be fixed forever. It may change with the world around us. And if that is true, then the biggest mystery is not simply why people once woke during the night. The bigger mystery is what happened to that quiet interval. Because somewhere between the old candle-lit bedroom and the brightly lit modern city, the night itself began to change. And when the night changed, so did the way people lived inside it.
When the night changed, people began to live inside it differently. But for a moment, let us return to that strange period between the two sleeps. The house is dark again. The first sleep has passed. Outside, almost everything has gone still. There are no engines in the distance. No streetlights. No glowing windows stretching across a city.
only the faint sounds that darkness makes when human beings stop filling it with noise. A person wakes, and instead of immediately trying to force sleep back into place, they remain awake. This is perhaps the most difficult part of the old sleep story for a modern mind to imagine. We are accustomed to thinking of nighttime wakefulness as a problem. You wake, you check the time, you calculate how long you have until morning, you turn over, you try again.
And the more you think about sleeping, the harder sleep can sometimes become. But the people of earlier centuries lived under different conditions. Their relationship with the night was shaped by necessity. If you woke in darkness, there were not many ways to distract yourself, and perhaps that made the experience less threatening. The quiet period between sleeps could simply become part of the rhythm of the household. One of the activities associated with nighttime wakefulness in historical sources is prayer. This is especially understandable in religious communities. Monks and nuns sometimes followed schedules that required them to rise during the night for religious observances. In a monastery, darkness did not necessarily mean complete inactivity. A bell could sound, a candle could be carried through a corridor.
Doors could open. Feet could move quietly across stone. A group of people could gather in a chapel while most of the surrounding world remained asleep. Then, after the service, the community could return to rest. For them, the night was not simply divided into sleeping and waking. It could contain several different states: rest, prayer, work, silence, and rest again. But religious life was only one part of medieval society. For ordinary households, nighttime wakefulness could have much simpler causes. Fire needed attention.
Before modern heating systems, the hearth was central to domestic life. A dying fire could mean cold. A neglected fire could become dangerous. Someone might wake to add fuel. Someone might check whether embers were still glowing. Someone might simply sit beside the warmth for a while. And then there were animals. In farming communities, the household did not completely disappear when people went to bed. Livestock still existed. Animals could become restless. A birth might occur. A predator might approach. Something might need attention. The night was never completely separated from practical life. Then there were children. A child could wake. A baby could cry. A parent might have to get up. In a world without modern medicine, electricity, or convenient household technology, nighttime caregiving could be physically demanding. Sleep was therefore not always something people could control.
It was interrupted by life itself. And that is an important reminder. When we talk about historical sleep, we are not talking about a perfect, peaceful routine. The past was not a sleep retreat. People experienced cold rooms, noise, illness, pain, crowded sleeping spaces, smoke, insects, fear, hunger, and many other things that could disturb rest. So the image of an ancient person peacefully sleeping for 4 hours, waking for a philosophical conversation, and then drifting back into perfect sleep is probably too romantic. Reality was messier. Yet within that messy reality, there were still periods when waking during the night could be ordinary, and one reason may have been social. Imagine 2 people waking at roughly the same time. One person stirs, the other opens their eyes. They whisper.
Perhaps they talk about something that happened during the day. Perhaps they discuss tomorrow's work. Perhaps they simply share the strange quietness of the night. This kind of nighttime conversation appears in historical references to the period between sleeps, and it reveals something fascinating. The middle of the night could become a private social space, a time when the day's responsibilities were temporarily suspended. Nobody was rushing. Nobody was preparing for work yet. The outside world was silent. For a short while, 2 people could simply talk.
There is also evidence from older literature that nighttime wakefulness could be associated with intimacy. This makes sense when we consider sleeping arrangements in earlier societies. Beds were not always private rooms. Families could sleep close together. Servants might sleep nearby. Married couples could share the same sleeping space.
And nighttime was one of the few periods when daytime labor had stopped. So the quiet interval between sleeps could have been a time for private conversation and closeness. But perhaps the most intriguing activity was one that required nothing at all. Thinking. Before modern entertainment, people had fewer distractions. If you woke at night, you could not automatically reach for something designed to occupy your mind. There was no infinite supply of information, no endless sequence of videos, no notifications. The darkness forced you to remain with your own thoughts. For some people, this may have been peaceful.
For others, frightening. For others, simply boring. And perhaps that is one reason historical descriptions of nighttime wakefulness are so difficult to interpret. A writer might describe someone awake during the night without telling us whether that person considered the experience pleasant, annoying, normal, or disturbing. The same physical event could have completely different meanings. A monk awake for prayer. A farmer awake because an animal was sick. A mother awake with a child. A guard awake because it was his duty. A traveler awake because the road was unsafe. A wealthy person awake because he could not sleep. All of them are awake, but their experiences are completely different. This is why we should be careful when imagining a universal two-shift sleep. The historical record does not support such a simple picture. Instead, it reveals a world where sleep and wakefulness could move into each other more fluidly, and the natural environment played a major role. Consider the difference between summer and winter.
In summer, sunset comes late. There may be several hours of usable light after the day's work is finished. In winter, darkness arrives much earlier. The evening stretches. People spend more time indoors. The night becomes longer. Without electric lighting, there is a natural pressure toward earlier rest. And when people go to bed early, the middle of the night becomes a much longer period of potential wakefulness. This may help explain why the idea of first and second sleep appears so naturally in some historical contexts. But there is another piece of the puzzle: the way people measured the night. Before modern clocks became common, ordinary people did not usually know the exact hour. They knew that it was dark. They knew that the night had progressed. They knew when certain bells rang. They knew when the stars moved across the sky. They knew when dawn was approaching, but they did not constantly monitor the minute hand. That changes the psychology of sleep. Imagine waking today and seeing 2:17 a.m. The number immediately gives the moment meaning. You might think, I have only 4 hours left. I am awake too long. Tomorrow will be difficult. Now remove the clock. You wake, you do not know whether it is 1:30 or 3. You simply know that it is still night. That uncertainty can make wakefulness feel less like failure. There is no deadline, no countdown, only time passing. Eventually, sleep returns.
And perhaps this is the most beautiful possibility hidden inside the old descriptions. The night did not always need to be conquered. It could simply be experienced. A person could lie awake beneath a dark roof while the rest of the world slept. They could listen, think, pray, talk, wait. And then when the body became tired again, they could return to sleep. Morning would come when it came. But this way of living with the night would become harder to maintain as societies changed, because the night was about to become brighter. And when human beings learned to create light on demand, darkness began losing its control over the rhythm of daily life. Candles became better. Oil lamps became more useful. Cities became brighter. Clocks became more precise. And eventually an entirely new force would arrive.
A force capable of turning midnight into something that looked almost like daytime. Artificial light. At first, it seemed like a small convenience. A brighter candle. A better lamp. A safer street. But slowly, almost unnoticed, it began changing the relationship between human beings and the night. The old world had been governed by darkness. The new world would begin learning how to defeat it. And once darkness could be defeated, there was no longer any reason for the evening to end when the sun went down. The night could become longer. The workday could become longer. Entertainment could continue.
Cities could remain awake. And eventually, the quiet interval between the first and second sleep would begin to disappear from ordinary life. Not all at once, not everywhere, but slowly, one lamp at a time, one clock at a time, one later bedtime at a time, until the night that once belonged to darkness began to belong to human schedules instead.
The night began to belong to human schedules instead. But that transformation did not happen overnight. For centuries, darkness remained one of the strongest forces shaping human life. If the sun disappeared, the world became quieter. If the fire went out, the room became dark. If the candle burned down, there was little choice but to stop. Human beings could extend the day for a while, but they could not truly defeat the night. Then, slowly, the balance began to change. The first important change was not electricity. It was something much older: better artificial lighting. Across different societies, people developed increasingly useful ways to create light after sunset. Oil lamps became common in some places. Candles became more practical. Lamps could be carried. Rooms could be illuminated. Streets could sometimes be made safer.
And suddenly, darkness was no longer an absolute command to stop. But light alone did not transform sleep. Another invention was just as important: the clock. Before mechanical clocks became widespread, time was often experienced through natural events: sunrise, sunset, church bells, meal times, work, prayer, the changing seasons. But mechanical clocks introduced something much more precise. They divided the day into measurable units. Hours could now be announced, minutes could eventually be counted, and gradually human activity began to synchronize itself with the clock. This was a profound change. Imagine a medieval town before precise clocks were common. The day begins with light. People work while the sun is up. Markets open.
Craftsmen work in their workshops. Farmers move through fields. As darkness arrives, activity slows. But now imagine the same town after clocks become more visible and more important. The hour can be announced. A bell can tell workers when something begins. Another bell can tell them when something ends. Time becomes something external, something that can be measured, something that can discipline behavior, and the night begins to acquire a structure of its own. In medieval Europe, church bells already played an enormous role in organizing daily life. They marked religious services. They announced important moments. They could warn of danger. They could regulate community activity. Night was therefore not completely silent.
The sound of a bell could travel across a dark town. A single strike might carry through narrow streets and sleeping houses. For people lying in bed, the bell became a reminder that time was passing. This matters because the experience of sleep is not only biological, it is also social. If everyone around you believes the day begins at a particular hour, you begin organizing your life around that expectation. If everyone expects workers to appear at dawn, you wake before dawn. If a factory opens at a fixed time, workers must be awake at a fixed time. If a school begins at a fixed hour, children must wake at a fixed hour. The clock slowly turns time into a schedule, and schedules eventually begin competing with natural rhythms. But this process was gradual.
For much of the medieval period, most people still lived according to agriculture and daylight. A farmer could not force the sun to rise earlier. A field could not be harvested simply because the clock said it was time. Winter still shortened the working day. Summer still stretched it. The seasons still mattered. The night remained powerful. And yet, something new was beginning. Cities were growing. Trade was expanding. Markets were becoming more active. Craft production was increasing. People were moving through urban streets after sunset.
And where there was economic activity, there was demand for light. More light meant more possible activity. A shopkeeper could remain open longer. A craftsman could continue working. A traveler could move more safely. A wealthy household could entertain guests later. The evening could stretch. And this was where the old rhythm of the night began to face competition. The first sleep had once been encouraged by darkness. But what happens when darkness arrives and the room is still bright? You can keep talking. You can keep working. You can keep eating. You can keep reading. You can keep celebrating. The night becomes an extension of the day. This does not mean everyone suddenly stopped sleeping in 2 periods. There was no single moment when humanity collectively changed its sleeping habits. Different regions changed at different speeds.
Different classes experienced the transformation differently. A wealthy household could afford more candles and lamps. A poor household might carefully conserve every source of fuel. A city could remain active late into the evening. A rural village might still become quiet soon after sunset. History is full of these contrasts. The same century could contain completely different nighttime experiences. And yet, the direction of change was unmistakable. Human beings were gaining more control over when they were awake. Then another transformation arrived: urban life. As towns and cities grew larger, the night became less empty. There were inns, taverns,
Markets, workshops, guards, travelers, couriers, and people who simply needed to move through the city after dark. Nighttime activity created new demands for organization. Lighting became increasingly important. Public safety became a concern. And timekeeping became increasingly valuable. The night was becoming measurable. Instead of simply being after sunset, it could be divided into hours. Instead of waiting for dawn, people could estimate how much time remained.
This seems ordinary to us, but psychologically it was revolutionary, because once you know exactly what time it is, you can make plans against the darkness. You can decide to stay awake another hour. You can decide to work until midnight. You can decide to wake someone at a particular moment. You can organize shifts, and eventually you can demand that large numbers of people do the same thing. That final step would transform sleep more dramatically than anything that came before. But before we reach the factories, we need to understand the changing evening, because the disappearance of the old nighttime rhythm was not caused by one invention.
It was caused by accumulation, a little more light, a little more accurate time, a little more nighttime commerce, a little more social activity, a little later bedtime, then another, and another. The human evening stretched, and as bedtime moved later, the first sleep itself became less distinct. If someone went to bed soon after sunset, there was plenty of night remaining. A natural period of wakefulness could occur several hours later. But if bedtime moved closer to midnight, there was far less time available for such a pattern. A person sleeping from midnight until morning would have no reason to describe the night as containing a first sleep and a second sleep. The schedule itself had changed. And this is perhaps one of the most important clues in the entire story.
The disappearance of 2-part sleep may not have required humans to develop a completely different brain. It may simply have required humans to reorganize the night, The same body, the same need for rest, but a different environment, a different bedtime, a different relationship with darkness, and a different society. Then came an age when this transformation accelerated, the Industrial Revolution. For thousands of years, human beings had mostly organized their lives around natural light, seasonal rhythms, and local communities. Now machines would begin determining the schedule. Factories needed workers, workers needed fixed hours required clocks, and clocks required people to obey them. The old night had been flexible, the industrial night would be disciplined. A factory did not care whether a worker felt that dawn had arrived. The shift began when the clock said it began. A bell rang, machines started.
People moved, and suddenly waking at the correct time became economically important. Sleep was no longer simply a private biological experience, it became part of a larger system. A worker who arrived late could lose wages. A factory that started late could lose production. A train could not wait for someone who slept through the morning. A school could not begin whenever children happened to wake. Modern society was beginning to synchronize millions of lives around the clock. And as this happened, the old flexibility of sleep became harder to maintain. The night was still dark, but darkness no longer controlled human behavior. The clock did. And soon another invention would make that control even stronger: electric light. For the first time, darkness itself could be pushed almost completely out of human spaces. Cities would glow after sunset, factories would operate through the night, homes would remain bright long after the stars appeared.
The old boundary between day and night would become increasingly blurred. And once the night could be turned into day, sleep would no longer be dictated primarily by the setting sun. It would become something scheduled, something calculated, something fitted between work and everything else. The ancient darkness had once told humans when to slow down. Now the clock would tell them when to sleep. And that quiet period between the first and second sleep would slowly become something people no longer recognized in their own lives.
That quiet period between the first and second sleep would slowly become something people no longer recognized in their own lives. And the force that changed it most dramatically was not simply the clock. It was the modern working day. As the Industrial Revolution spread, the relationship between human beings and time became increasingly strict. For centuries, many people had worked according to the rhythms of daylight and the seasons. Now machines introduced something different. Machines did not get tired in the same way people did. A factory could continue operating long after sunset. A furnace could burn through the night. A spinning machine could keep turning. A production line could continue as long as there were workers available to operate it.
And that created a new question. If the machines could work through the night, why couldn't people? The answer, of course, was that people needed sleep. But industrial society was beginning to organize human beings around the needs of production. The exact time you woke became important. The exact time you arrived became important. The exact time you left became important. A worker could no longer simply rise when the morning felt ready. There was a shift to catch, a factory bell to answer, a workplace waiting for them. And suddenly, sleeping until the body naturally decided to wake was no longer always possible. The clock had become an authority. Imagine a worker in an industrial town. It is still dark outside.
The sky has not begun to brighten. The streets are cold. Most houses are quiet. But inside one small home, someone is already awake. Not because the sun has risen. Not because the birds have started singing. But because the clock says it is time. A few minutes later, other houses begin doing the same thing. Doors open. Footsteps appear on the streets. People move toward factories. The town begins to wake before the natural world does. This was a profound change. For the first time, large numbers of people could be required to synchronize their mornings with a mechanical schedule, rather than the sunrise.
And that changed the meaning of sleep. Sleep was no longer simply what happened when darkness became too deep. It became something that had to fit around work. You had to be asleep early enough to wake at the required hour. And if you stayed awake too long, the consequences could be immediate. Fatigue, mistakes, lost wages, poor performance. Industrial society therefore created a powerful incentive for consolidated nighttime sleep. The more fixed the morning became, the more valuable uninterrupted rest became. And this is where the old middle-of-the-night wakefulness began to lose its place.
Imagine waking naturally in the middle of the night. In an earlier world, perhaps you could remain awake for a while. You could pray, talk, think, tend the fire, then return to sleep. But now imagine that you must be standing inside a factory before sunrise. Suddenly, those quiet hours are not so harmless. You need every remaining minute of sleep. The middle of the night becomes something to protect, something that must not interrupt the schedule. The culture of sleep begins changing, and then artificial light makes the transformation even more powerful. Electricity allowed people to create brightness almost anywhere. At first, electric lighting was expensive and unevenly distributed, but as it spread, cities became brighter.
Streets that once disappeared into darkness remained visible. Buildings could stay open later. Factories could operate for longer hours. Homes could remain active deep into the evening. Night was becoming an extension of daytime. Think about what that meant psychologically. For most of human history, sunset had been a powerful signal. It told the body and the mind that the day was ending. But now, sunset could happen outside, while inside the house, bright lamps continued shining. The sky set night, the room set day. And increasingly, people followed the room. Dinner could happen later, conversation could continue, reading could continue, work could continue, entertainment could continue. The evening expanded. Bedtime moved later.
And yet the morning remained fixed. That created a problem. If people stayed awake later but still had to wake early, something had to give. Sleep became compressed. The solution was not necessarily to return to an older pattern of nighttime wakefulness. Instead, modern society increasingly encouraged people to sleep in one continuous block. Go to bed. Stay asleep. Wake in the morning. Repeat. This pattern fit neatly into the industrial timetable. It was efficient, it was predictable, and above all, it was compatible with the clock. The idea of a fixed night's sleep therefore became increasingly powerful. But another transformation was happening at the same time. Transportation. Railways changed the meaning of distance. Trains needed schedules. Passengers needed schedules. Workers needed to know when trains departed. A station could not operate according to someone's personal rhythm.
If the train left at 6 in the morning, you had to be awake before 6. The clock became part of everyday survival. And as transportation networks expanded, standardized time became increasingly important. Local communities had once lived with slightly different versions of time based on the position of the sun. Now industrial society needed agreement. The same hour, the same minute, the same schedule. Time became standardized. And once time became standardized, sleep could be standardized too. This is one reason the modern idea of a regular night's sleep became so culturally powerful. It was not simply about biology.
It was about coordination. Millions of people needed to wake at roughly predictable times. Children needed to attend school. Workers needed to arrive at factories and offices. Trains needed to depart. Businesses needed to open. Markets needed to function. Society needed people awake at the same time.
Sleep, therefore, became part of the machinery of modern life, and eventually people began talking about sleep in increasingly numerical terms. How many hours? What time did you go to bed? What time did you wake? How much sleep did you get?
The night became measurable. The same clock that had once divided work from leisure now divided wakefulness from sleep. But there is an important detail here. The disappearance of segmented sleep was not necessarily caused by one dramatic invention. It was a slow cultural shift. Earlier bedtime patterns changed. Artificial lighting encouraged later evenings. Industrial work demanded earlier mornings. Transportation created fixed schedules. Schools established regular start times. Urban life extended nighttime activity. And gradually, people adapted. The older rhythm became less practical. The new rhythm became normal. Then something else happened. The bedroom itself changed.
As housing became increasingly organized around private spaces, sleep became more separated from the rest of household life. In earlier homes, sleeping arrangements could be crowded. Several people might share a room. Animals might be nearby. The fire might be in the same general space. Nighttime life was more visible. Modern homes increasingly created rooms designed specifically for sleeping. The bedroom became a private environment, dark, quiet, controlled, and that made sleep itself feel more like a separate activity. You enter the bedroom, you close the door.
You turn off the light. You sleep. Morning comes. You get up. The night becomes a single enclosed block. This is very different from the older world, where waking, talking, praying, tending the household and sleeping could overlap. Modern life separated them. Sleep became something that belonged to a particular place and a particular schedule. And with that came a new cultural expectation. You were supposed to sleep continuously. If you woke during the night, something seemed wrong. People began looking for explanations. Stress, noise, illness, bad habits, an uncomfortable bed. But the historical possibility that nighttime wakefulness had once been more ordinary became increasingly invisible.
The modern world had forgotten the rhythm that came before it. And then, in the 20th century, the pressure became even stronger. Electric light was no longer a luxury. It became ordinary. Homes were brightly illuminated. Cities remained active long after sunset. Television brought moving images into the bedroom and living room. Later came computers, then smartphones. The human evening became almost completely independent of the setting sun. For the first time, people could remain connected to the world at almost any hour. Midnight no longer looked like midnight. A person sitting in a brightly lit room at 12 o'clock could feel almost as awake as someone sitting there at noon. The darkness outside no longer controlled the darkness inside. And yet the clock still demanded a morning. That contradiction defines much of modern sleep. We can stay awake almost as long as we want, but we still have to get up. We can extend the evening, but we cannot extend the morning. We can turn night into day.
But our bodies still need rest. And somewhere inside that tension, the old two-part night disappeared. Not because someone officially abolished it, not because humanity held a meeting and decided to stop waking between sleeps. It simply became unnecessary, then inconvenient, then unfamiliar, and eventually almost forgotten. But the old pattern did leave behind something important. Those historical references to first sleep and second sleep did not disappear completely. They remained in old books, old expressions,
Old descriptions of nighttime life. Fragments of a different relationship with darkness. A reminder that the way we sleep today is not necessarily the only way humans have ever slept.
And that brings us to the final question. If people in earlier centuries could sometimes sleep in separate periods, and if modern society gradually encouraged one consolidated night's sleep, does that mean the two-sleep pattern was the natural human way, or was it simply one possible response to a particular environment? The answer is more complicated than either extreme. Human beings are adaptable. Our sleep responds to biology, but it also responds to light, work, culture, family, noise, climate, stress, and social expectations. The past cannot give us a single perfect sleep schedule, but it can show us something far more interesting. Sleep has a history. And whenever the world around us changes,
Our nights can change with it. So the mystery remains. Perhaps humans did not simply forget how to sleep in two shifts. Perhaps we built a world in which we no longer had much reason to. And if that is true, then the story of the two sleeps is not really a story about something ancient that disappeared. It is a story about how civilization slowly changed the night itself. And now, as the modern world grows quieter for a few hours, we can return to the question that began our journey. When we close our eyes tonight, are we following an ancient human rhythm? Or are we following a schedule invented by clocks, factories, and electric lights? The answer may lie somewhere between the two, because our bodies belong to the ancient world, but our nights belong to the modern one. And perhaps that is the strangest thing about the history of sleep. We carry the same biological inheritance as people who lived thousands of years ago. The same basic need for darkness. The same need for rest. The same ancient nervous system responding to light and darkness. And yet, we sleep inside a completely different world. A world that glows long after sunset. A world of clocks, alarms, screens, traffic, factories, offices, schools, and schedules. A world in which midnight can look almost exactly like noon. So what should we make of the old references to first sleep and second sleep?
Did humans really sleep in two shifts? The safest answer is more interesting than a simple yes or no. There is historical evidence that some people, in some periods and places, described nighttime sleep as divided into separate periods. There are references to a first sleep, there are references to a second sleep. There are descriptions of people being awake during the night, and there are many examples of nighttime activities taking place between periods of rest. But that does not mean every human being once followed the exact same schedule. History does not support that. People have always been different. Some probably slept through the night. Some woke naturally. Some were awakened by children. Some by work. Some by religious duties. Some by illness. Some by noise. And some may simply have experienced a period of wakefulness before returning to sleep.
The important point is not that there was one ancient sleep schedule. The important point is that the organization of sleep was flexible, and that flexibility gradually became harder to maintain. Modern society created something powerful, a synchronized day. Millions of people waking at similar times, working at similar times, eating at similar times, traveling according to schedules, children attending school according to schedules. The clock became one of the great organizers of human life, and sleep had to fit inside it. This is why the modern idea of a continuous night's sleep became so useful. If you need to wake at a fixed hour, you want your sleeping period to be predictable.
You want to lie down, fall asleep, remain asleep, and wake when the alarm tells you to. The system works, but it is important to understand what that means. Something being useful does not necessarily mean it is the only way the human body can sleep. Human sleep has always shown variation. People can sleep in different patterns depending on circumstances. The environment matters. Light matters. Daily schedules matter. Age matters. Work matters. Culture matters. And throughout history, human beings have adapted to all of these things. So perhaps the two-sleep pattern was not a forgotten secret that everyone once followed. Perhaps it was simply one of many ways humans could organize the night. And yet, there is something deeply fascinating about the idea, because it gives us a glimpse of a world in which waking during the night did not automatically mean something had gone wrong. Imagine that again. You wake in darkness. There is no alarm, no glowing screen, no clock demanding that you go back to sleep immediately.
The room is quiet. The fire is low. The people around you are resting. You are awake, and for a little while, that is enough. Maybe you sit quietly. Maybe you speak to someone. Maybe you pray. Maybe you think about tomorrow. Maybe you simply listen to the silence. Then, eventually, without forcing anything, tiredness returns. You lie down, and sleep comes again. There is something almost dreamlike about that rhythm. But it is important not to romanticize the past. The people who lived this way did not enjoy perfect nights. Their bedrooms could be cold, their beds uncomfortable, their homes crowded.
Their lives physically exhausting. Illness could make sleep miserable. Hunger could wake someone. Danger could wake someone. Children could wake someone. The past was not peaceful simply because it was dark. What changed was the meaning of nighttime wakefulness. Modern society often treats sleep as a performance. We count hours. We track stages. We measure quality. We worry about interruptions. We become anxious about being awake.
And that anxiety can itself become part of the problem. The historical story reminds us of something simple. Nighttime wakefulness is not necessarily a moral failure. It is not evidence that you have done something wrong. Human beings have never been perfectly predictable machines. We wake, we sleep, we dream, we become alert, we become tired again. The rhythm can change. And perhaps that is why the old idea of the two sleeps continues to fascinate people today.
It challenges a modern assumption, the assumption that there has always been one correct way to sleep. There hasn't. The history of sleep is a history of adaptation. Before electric light, darkness shaped the evening. After artificial light, people could extend it. Before industrial schedules, work could often follow natural rhythms more closely. After factories and standardized time, people had to fit their lives around the clock. Before modern entertainment, the nighttime hours were quiet. After television, computers, and smartphones, the night became another opportunity for stimulation. The world changed, and sleep changed with it. But one question still remains. Why do we so often hear about the 8-hour night? Where did that expectation come from? The answer is not a single moment or a single person. The modern 8-hour idea became connected with changing work practices, industrial reform, and the desire to divide the day into roughly equal portions of work, leisure, and rest.
The famous ideal of 8 hours for work, 8 for recreation, and 8 for rest became associated with labor movements and social reform. But the reality of human sleep was never as neat as that slogan. People slept different amounts, work schedules varied, families varied, cultures varied, And even today, people do not all sleep at exactly the same time or for exactly the same duration. The 8-hour idea became a useful cultural benchmark. It was not a command written into human biology. That distinction matters, because once we understand that, the old history of segmented sleep becomes easier to understand too. We do not need to choose between two extreme stories. We do not have to believe that every ancient person slept twice, and we do not have to believe that modern sleep is somehow unnatural. The truth is more human. We adapt. Our sleep changes with our surroundings.
And civilization has changed those surroundings dramatically. For thousands of years, darkness was unavoidable. Then we learned to carry fire. We learned to burn oil. We learned to make better candles. We built clocks. We built factories. We built electric lights. We built cities that never completely go dark. And now we carry tiny glowing screens in our pockets. Each invention pushed the night a little farther away from nature. But the night never completely disappeared. Even now, beneath all the artificial light, the old rhythm remains inside us.
When evening arrives, our bodies still recognize something. When darkness deepens, many people begin to feel tired. When morning light appears, the body begins preparing for wakefulness. The ancient signals are still there. We simply live among much louder signals. And perhaps that is the real lesson hidden inside the story of the two sleeps. Human beings did not simply forget how to sleep. We changed the world in which sleep happens. The ancient night was shaped by darkness. The medieval night was shaped by fire, bells, prayer, work, and community. The industrial night was shaped by clocks and factories. The modern night is shaped by electricity, information, entertainment, and endless availability.
Each world created its own rhythm. And tonight, when you finally close your eyes, you become part of that enormous history. For a few hours, the clocks can continue without you. The factories can continue without you. The screens can go dark. The city can keep moving somewhere beyond the walls. You do not need to follow every minute. You do not need to know exactly how long you have been asleep. You can simply rest. And if you wake during the night, perhaps there is no need to immediately fear the silence. You can listen to it. The room is dark. The world is quieter. The night has not disappeared. It is still here, just as it was for countless generations before electric light. And perhaps, for a brief moment, you can imagine one of those distant nights. A small home, a dying fire, a quiet room, someone awake in the darkness. No alarm, no glowing screen, no schedule demanding attention. Just a human being, awake for a little while beneath the night sky. And eventually, sleep returns. The second sleep begins. Morning will come when it comes. The world will brighten. The clocks will start again. But for now, there is nothing to solve, nothing to calculate, nothing you need to remember. Only the quiet rhythm of breathing, the darkness around you, and the slow passage of the night.
Perhaps humans once slept in 2 shifts. Perhaps sometimes they slept in 1. Perhaps the truth was never quite as simple as either. But one thing is certain: the way we sleep has a history. And tonight, as you drift toward your own sleep, you are joining that history once again. The lights are fading. The room is quiet. The night is deep. And somewhere between waking and dreaming,
the ancient rhythm continues. And now, as this long journey through the history of sleep comes to an end, there is nothing left to wonder about tonight. The clocks can keep ticking, the lights can keep glowing somewhere beyond your window, but for now, you can simply let the night be quiet. Close your eyes. Let the thoughts of ancient fires, silent villages, forgotten nights and distant centuries slowly fade away. Perhaps humans once slept in 2 shifts. Perhaps they simply followed the darkness in a different way. Either way, the night has always belonged to rest. So let yourself rest now. No more questions, no more history to follow. Just darkness, quiet breathing, and sleep. Good night, and may your dreams carry you gently into morning.